with Arnold Dean. Hot talk, great guests. Weeknights at 6:15 from WTIC, Hartford.
BBC Radio, Canada's public broadcast.
Try Carter's Little Liver Pill. Good advice.
Good mornings only on KCMO Kansas City. It's 8 o'clock.
When you're tuned to CDS Radio.
This is the DX Central from the Static Podcast.
From Studio B of the North Shore Studios in Mandeville, Louisiana.
In the early days of the 20th century, the world was still tied to wires. Morse code clicked across telegraph lines. News traveled by print and train. And wireless, well, that was just a dream, an idea whispered in labs and workshops. But then, in a garage just outside of Pittsburgh, a man named Frank Conrad began to experiment. And armed with some spare parts and an endless curiosity, Frank Conrad would light one of the first true beacons of broadcasting. Little did he know those sparks in his workshop would ignite something far greater, a revolution in communication, culture, and connection. And from those humble beginnings came a signal that would change the world. A signal that still travels the night sky more than a century later. This is the story of KDKA, one of the first commercial radio stations in the world. It is the story of the sound that first captivated an entire nation. And if you listen closely, you can still hear that sound today.
From Marconi to megahertz, from sparks to streaming. This is the history of radio on the DX Central from the Static Podcast.
At the turn of the 20th century, the world was connected by wires. Telegraph lines stretched across cities and countries, carrying the tiny dots and dashes of Morse code. News, stock prices, personal messages, all traveling through copper wires to telegraph offices. Wire communication was about as high-tech as it got. The idea of sending a message through the air without any wires at all, well, that seemed almost magical. But that magic was about to become real. First, let's turn back the clock to 1901, where on a wind-swept cliff in Cornwall, England, a young inventor named Guglielmo Marconi stared across the Atlantic. As his transmitter crackled, he sent a string of Morse code messages into the sky. Thousands of miles away in Newfoundland, the message was received. Marconi proved that invisible waves could carry information. Little did he know that someday those same waves would carry so much more. A few years later, in Massachusetts, another inventor named Reginald Fessenden took the next step. On Christmas Eve of 1906, he lifted a violin and played a carol into his microphone. Sailors at sea, expecting the usual sounds of telegraph messages, suddenly heard a human voice reading scripture and then music. And once again, the bar was reset, as the first transmission of voice and music has crossed the air. The sound is faint, but the idea is powerful, and the next invention will make it practical. In New York, an inventor named Lee DeForest developed the audion tube, a small glass bulb that amplified those fragile radio signals until they were able to fill a room with sound. That little tube would transform wireless from an experiment into a communication revolution. By the 1910s, thousands of amateurs called hams were building their own sets in garages and attics. The airwaves buzzed with experiments and call signs and curiosity. The government first tried to bring order to the chaos with the Radio Act of 1912, which required every station to be licensed. That order wouldn't last long. As World War I began, the U.S. government shut down all private transmissions. The air was silent. In 1919, as peace returned, so did radio. Thousands of operators took to the air once more, filled with a new sense of possibility. One of those operators was an engineer at Westinghouse Electric in Pittsburgh. His name was Frank Conrad. In his garage, he built a little transmitter, call sign 8XK, and started playing phonograph records for neighbors. On clear evenings, the music drifted miles across the city, and listeners wrote him letters asking for more. A local department store took notice and ran an advertisement selling radios to an eager public for $10 each. That advertisement caught the eye of Westinghouse executive Harry P. Davis. If people are buying radios just to hear a few experimenters, what would happen if Westinghouse built a station for the entire city to hear? Well, that question would change the world forever.
The voices all came from everywhere. Every boy in the world was there. And where do you think they held the affair? In Pittsburgh, PA.
Frank Conrad didn't set out to change the world. He was just an engineer who loved to tinker. Conrad famously built his own radio to settle a $5 bet, which is worth around $110 today, regarding the accuracy of his watch. He built the radio from scratch just so he could receive time signals transmitted by the U.S. Naval Observatory. And yes, to receive radio signals, he had to build his own receiver. This was still during the time when radio was largely the realm of the experimenter, the tinkerer. Oh, and Frank did in fact win that bet. Soon, Conrad was no longer content to listen to the radio. He wanted to be the one transmitting. So he set about to build a transmitter on the second floor of his garage on Penn Avenue in Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. In 1916, under the license call sign 8XK, Frank Conrad began his transmissions. While radio had up to this point been conceived as a person-to-person communication medium, Conrad imagined something a little different. So he borrowed an agricultural term that referred to spreading of seeds far and wide to describe his intent to reach a broad audience. This was the birth of broadcasting. After spending considerable time in front of his microphone, he decided to give his voice a rest and began playing records on his gramophone. The music from his turntable and microphone propagated through the Pittsburgh air, and to his amazement, it spread beyond the block. A few miles at first, then dozens. Each night, more listeners tuned in, and Conrad had found his audience. They wrote him letters asking, "When will you be on again?" Down at the Westinghouse electric plant, executive Harry P. Davis noticed those letters and a newspaper ad from Horn's department store.
Air concert picked up by radio here. The music was from a Victrola in the home of Frank Conrad. Mr. Conrad is a wireless enthusiast and puts on these wireless concerts periodically for the entertainment of many people in this district who have wireless sets. Amateur wireless sets are on sale here, $10 and up.
Davis saw more than a hobby. He saw a business model.
If people will tune in to listen to this fellow, let's build a station for him.
And so, in the summer of 1920, Westinghouse gave the order, build a new station at the East Pittsburgh plant, a station that would broadcast to the public, not just other amateurs. Up on the roof of their 9-story K building, engineers went to work. They built a small wooden shack, erected a canvas tent to fend off the weather, and stretched antenna wires between a smokestack and a tall steel mast. Inside the shack, they installed a 100-watt transmitter designed by Conrad himself, the same technology he had refined in his garage. For weeks, the crew tested and tuned. Call letters were assigned, temporarily 8ZZ, then formally KDKA. A random sequence from the Commerce Department, but one that would soon become legend.
The American Republic began the blazed trail of representative popular government. Representative democracy was proclaimed the safe agency of highest human freedom. America headed the forward procession of civil, human, and religious liberties, which ultimately will affect the liberation of all mankind.
It's November 2nd, 1920, election night. The sky over Pittsburgh is cold and clear. Inside the rooftop tent, a small group of engineers could be found huddled around a microphone. Telegraph wires from the Pittsburgh Post carry results from across the country. At 8 p.m., announcer Leo Rosenberg takes a deep breath and begins.
This is KDKA. We shall now broadcast the election returns.
His voice echoes off the tent walls, then disappears into the night. Down in homes and garages throughout the city, listeners lean into headphones and crystal sets. They hear a voice reaching out from the night, calm, confident, live. Between results, the crew spins phonograph records. Classical tunes drift over the city. One listener said it was like hearing the future. Newspapers the next morning called the transmission clear and distinct. Magazines took notice, and the phrase wireless telephone broadcast began to appear in print. The broadcast ended late that night with Warren G. Harding declared the winner. The stage, though, was set for much more than a change in government. Radio was going to change everything. In those few hours, Westinghouse and Frank Conrad had proven that radio could be much more than a hobby. It could be a service. A few days later, the company announced regular scheduled programming. By December, KDKA was on the air every evening, playing music, news, and local announcements. The rooftop tent would soon give way to a studio. The transmitter grew stronger, and the word broadcasting officially entered the cultural lexicon forever. From a garage to a factory roof, radio had taken its first step into the world. The success of KDKA's election night broadcast spread like a shockwave throughout the country. Reports poured in from listeners beyond Pittsburgh and parts of Ohio and West Virginia who had heard the voice of Leo Rosenberg float out of the night. The story ran in newspapers nationwide, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about this new wireless telephone. Westinghouse knew it had struck gold. They began building more transmitters, planting stations in cities across the country. WBZ in Springfield, Massachusetts, WJZ in Newark, New Jersey, KYW in Chicago. Each station modeled after KDKA, a public service that would also sell radios. But Westinghouse wasn't alone for long. Engineers, college professors, and newspapers all began building their own transmitters. Every few weeks, a new call sign appeared somewhere on the dial. America had caught the radio fever. Stores couldn't keep receivers in stock. People built crystal sets from kits, stringing antennas out of bedroom windows. Families gathered around their radios to hear music that seemed to appear out of thin air. And every night, somewhere in those radios, was the steady voice of KDKA. With so many new stations taking to the air, the dial was becoming a bit crowded. There were no standard frequencies yet and no coordination. Stations often stepped on each other's signals and sometimes broadcast on the same frequency. Listeners would tune in to hear a song from KDKA, only to hear a New York station fade in over the top. The airwaves were a beautiful chaos, but chaos nonetheless. In Washington, the Department of Commerce saw what was happening and stepped in. In December of 1921, they created the official broadcasting license. Stations intended for public programs were assigned to two wavelengths, 360 meters for entertainment, 485 meters for weather and farm reports. For the first time, broadcasting was defined by law. And who was there at the front of the line when those licenses were issued? KDKA, the station that started the movement. In 1922 alone, more than 500 new stations signed on. By 1923, there were more than 700. The country that once relied on wires and telegraphs was now consumed by voices and music, snatched out of thin air. Each night, that air glowed with the sounds of a new medium being born. And at the center of it all was that station that started out in a tiny wooden shack on the roof of the Westinghouse K building. The place where a voice once said, "This is KDKA." Now the rest of the world was following suit.
I'm of course surprised that the H.G. Wells classic, which is the original for many fantasies about invasions by mythical monsters from the planet Mars, I'm extremely surprised to learn that a story which has become familiar to children through the medium of comic strips and many succeeding novels and adventure stories should have had such an immediate and profound effect upon radio listeners.
By 1923, radio is no longer an experiment. It's a phenomenon. There are hundreds of stations on the air, but KDKA stands apart, not just because it was among the first, but because it keeps reinventing what radio can be. In January of 1921, KDKA began broadcasting live from Calvary Episcopal Church in Pittsburgh, the first regularly scheduled remote broadcast in the United States. Microphones perched in the pews carried the sound of a congregation to listeners who had never been inside the walls. On Sunday mornings, families who couldn't make it to church sat around their radios and listened. A few months later, the station made headlines again by airing the results of the boxing match between Jack Dempsey versus Georges Carpentier. Those results were telegraphed in real time to Pittsburgh and read live on the air, the first sports broadcast of its kind. And then on August 5th of that same year, a young announcer named Harold Arlen took to the microphone at Forbes Field, where the first play-by-play of a Major League Baseball game went out over the air. The Pirates defeated the Phillies 8-5 on that day, but the bigger winner, that was radio. By the late 1920s, KDKA was a daily companion. Mornings brought weather and market reports for farmers and traders. Afternoons were filled with music and studio concerts. Evenings delivered news, drama, and entertainment. The station became the voice of Pittsburgh, steady, reliable, and familiar, and its reach kept growing. As the 1930s dawned, radio became the heart of the American home. Families gathered around their sets to hear presidential addresses, World Series games, and big band concerts. KDKA brought the world to the living room of their audience. In March of 1941, under the North American Radio Broadcasting Agreement known as NARBA, KDKA moved to 1020 kHz as a clear channel station, and shortly thereafter the FCC granted authority for full 50,000 watt operation day and night, non-directional, making KDKA one of the most powerful signals in all of North America. At sunset, its voice could be heard from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. At midnight, when conditions were right, it could skip across the Atlantic Ocean. When disaster struck, KDKA was there. In March of 1936, the Ohio River overflowed, sending floodwaters into downtown Pittsburgh. The city was cut off, telephone lines failed, and streets became rivers.
America is suffering its major flood disaster. The catastrophe that struck at Pittsburgh has caused unbelievable damage. $25 million damage here alone, $100 million in Pennsylvania. 35 are dead here, with nothing known of hundreds missing. Disaster followed on the heels of disaster. Fires broke out, with firemen helpless. For a time, a major conflagration threatened. The city is isolated, railroads paralyzed, no food is reaching Pittsburgh. A fortunate drop in temperature checked further thaws that might have fed swollen streams. But it was 2 days before the water started to subside. Typhoid now threatens from polluted water, famine, and disease. Troops called in to prevent people from returning to their homes. Pittsburgh, a city of desolation.
KDKA stayed on the air around the clock, relaying information, rescue locations, and comfort to a city in crisis. For many listeners, the station became the voice of hope. And then suddenly, the world went to war. When the United States entered World War II, radio became the nation's lifeline of information, and KDKA stood at the heart of it. From its 50,000-watt transmitter in Allison Park, the station's signal reached from the Atlantic coast to the plains of the Midwest. In homes, factories, and military barracks, eager audiences gathered around the radio to hear the latest reports. KDKA brought Pittsburgh and the nation the voices of the war. News from London during the Blitz, reports from correspondents in Europe and the Pacific, and President Roosevelt's fireside chats.
Our ultimate objectives in this war continue to be Berlin and Tokyo. I ask you to bear in mind that these objectives mean that we have still a long way to go before attaining them. The great news that you have heard today from General Eisenhower does not give you license to settle back in your rocking chairs and say, well, that's over.
The station interrupted regular programs to bring bulletins about the battlefronts, the war bonds drive, and casualty reports from overseas. At a time when newspapers were often hours or even days behind, radio delivered news instantly. KDKA's news team worked throughout the night, reading teletype reports straight into the microphone. For years, many could still remember the morning of December the 7th, 1941, when the station broke into its Sunday programming with the words,
"We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced."
That day, radio became something more than entertainment. It became a companion, a messenger, and for many, a source of comfort and courage. KDKA stayed on the air around the clock throughout the war, carrying news, music, and messages of hope to millions. And when the war finally ended in 1945, the celebrations in Pittsburgh were heard live on the air, a city rejoicing through the station that had stood by it through every dark hour. And through it all, those two towers on the hills above Pittsburgh beamed out 50,000 watts of American life. By the mid-1920s, radio had grown too big for any one city. There were stations in every major market, each with its own personality and programs. But something was missing, a way to connect them all. So in 1926, a new idea emerged, the network. The Radio Corporation of America, RCA, teamed up with General Electric and Westinghouse to form the National Broadcasting Company. They're known as NBC. With Westinghouse as one of the founders, KDKA was right there at the start, one of the original network affiliates. Through NBC, programs could be sent by telephone line from a central studio in New York to stations across the country. A single performance heard by millions. Suddenly, radio wasn't just local, it was national. America was listening together. For KDKA, this was a new chapter. Pittsburgh listeners could now hear national programs like the RCA Symphony, comedy hours, and presidential addresses, while the rest of the country could now hear KDKA's reports and Westinghouse special broadcasts right from Pittsburgh. But network radio also changed the business side of things. Sponsored shows such as the Lucky Strike Hour and the Fleischmann's Yeast program, well, they brought advertising into the mainstream. KDKA adapted quickly, using its news reputation to attract both local and national sponsors. As the 30s turned into the 40s, KDKA switched networks and affiliations more than once. First, a quick history lesson. In the early days of network radio, NBC ran two separate networks, NBC Blue and NBC Red. NBC Red was more commercially driven, with the most popular advertiser-supported entertainment shows like Jack Benny, Burns and Allen, Fibber McGee and Molly, things like that. NBC Blue focused more on public service and cultural programming, less advertiser-heavy content such as symphonies and educational talks, news, and religious programs. KDKA originally carried NBC Blue programming partly because of its news and public service reputation. Later, they changed to NBC Red. Years later, they would find their longest home with CBS Radio. Now, these changes were more than just paperwork. They reflected how rapidly broadcasting itself was evolving. New laws forced NBC to split off their networks, with one of those being handed over to a brand new competitor called ABC, the American Broadcast Corporation. while the Columbia Broadcast System, or CBS, under the leadership of William S. Paley, pushed for stronger news coverage and more journalistic standards. In that environment, KDKA thrived. Its engineers, producers, and announcers, they were known throughout the industry for their professionalism. By the end of World War II, KDKA was both a local station and a national brand, the voice of Pittsburgh that could be heard from coast to coast. And then the next frontier arrived: television. In January of 1949, Westinghouse launched KDKA TV on Channel 2, bringing the station's identity into a whole new medium. Same call letters, same city, same trusted name, now in both sound and picture. By 1954, KDKA TV joined the CBS television network, and the radio side began carrying CBS news content as well. The two mediums worked hand in hand, delivering information across the airwaves. By the mid-1950s, KDKA stood at the center of an empire. Westinghouse owned radio and TV stations across the country: KYW, WBZ, KPIX, but KDKA remained the flagship, the original. Engineers from other Westinghouse stations visited Pittsburgh. They came to learn how to build reliable signal chains, how to balance local programming with network content, and how to maintain that distinctive KDKA sound. When people talked about quality radio, they often said, do it like KDKA does it. Through the network era, KDKA kept its identity clear: local voices, national reach. In an age when America was tuning in to the same shows and hearing the same news at the same time, KDKA reminded listeners that real radio still came from a real place.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket, a three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster, in the class of an intercontinental missile, its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
The war was over, and America, she was booming. Televisions began to fill living rooms, but radio was still the heartbeat of the home. For KDKA, the post-war years are a period of invention and personality. The station is no longer just a voice reading news or playing music. It's a friend in the kitchen, a companion in the car, a neighbor you know by name. In the early 1950s, Pittsburgh wakes up to a new kind of morning show. A young announcer named Reg Kordick creates Kordick & Company, a mix of comedy bits, characters, and local humor. Their brand of imagination turns radio into theater for the mind. Kordick invents a whole cast of fictional Pittsburghers, all played by himself. From traffic reporters to wacky neighbors, listeners tuned in before work and drove to the sound of laughter. Kordick & Company became a Pittsburgh institution and a blueprint for the modern morning show. By the late 1950s and 60s, KDKA balances music and information with expertise. Top 40 hits flow between news updates, traffic, and local events. The station becomes the soundtrack of Pittsburgh life from morning drive to midnight sign-off. But unlike the new top 40 giants that were all music and no substance, KDKA kept its roots in service. When the steel mills closed for a strike, the station stayed on air with round-the-clock updates. When a major storm hit the region, KDKA relayed evacuation information and weather warnings. Even as music styles changed from swing to rock to soul, the station's credibility never faded. Through the 1970s and 80s, KDKA defined what full-service radio meant. The day started with news, traffic, and weather. Midday brought music and local interviews. Evenings mixed sports and call-in talk. In 1970, KDKA made history again when Ed King hosted one of the first long-form talk segments devoted to public call-ins, a format that would soon become the cornerstone of American news talk radio. By the 1980s, competition from FM stations was intense. FM offered clearer sound, stereo music, and a younger audience. But KDKA adapted. It leaned into what FM couldn't do: local connections, talk shows, election coverage, and live news reporting. That became the station's strength. The familiar voice of Fred Hansberger, the insight of Mike Pentecost, the warmth of Larry Richard. KDKA built its identity on trust. And then in 1992, the station took its biggest step yet into the modern era. On April 10th, 1992, KDKA formally ended its music programming and became America's first full-time news talk station. The final music track they played that day? It was American Pie by Don McLean. The lyrics were fitting. The day the music died. But for KDKA, it was the day radio was reborn. The switch to news talk wasn't just a format change, it was a return to purpose. From that moment on, KDKA would be the station you turn to when it mattered the most. Breaking news, local politics, community conversation, and every voice that made Pittsburgh what it is. By the 1990s, the AM dial was changing fast. Music had moved over to FM. Car radios came standard with stereo sound, and a new generation of listeners were now growing up without ever touching the AM portion of the dial. For many stations, that was the beginning of the end, but not for KDKA. While others struggled to find their identity, KDKA knew exactly who it was, a source of news, truth, and community. The station built on its news talk foundation, adding local programs, investigative reporting, and voices that defined a generation of Pittsburgh radio. Throughout the 2000s, KDKA continued to evolve. New technology was changing how people listened. Streaming, podcast, and on-demand content were redefining what radio meant. Rather than resist, KDKA adapted. The station launched its own website. It archived shows online. It began streaming its signal around the world. And for the first time, expats from Pittsburgh could listen from Tokyo, London, or Melbourne and hear a voice from home. The station's brand evolved again when Odyssey, then Intercom and before that CBS Radio, brought KDKA into a new digital family. Now, KDKA could be found on the app, on smartphones and smart devices, and in high-definition radio. And for the first time in its century-long history, KDKA's signal was no longer limited by the horizon. It was global. Still, the station never abandoned its roots. To reach younger audiences and serve listeners in the hills and valleys where AM signals may struggle, KDKA added an FM translator on 100.1 FM and a simulcast on 93.7 KDKA FM HD2, a first for the market. Now, Pittsburghers could hear their heritage station in crisp FM quality sound, while DXers could still pull in the AM signal after dark across half the continent. And in 2020, KDKA celebrated a century on the air, 100 years of voices, news, and history. From a tent on the rooftop to a global stream online. During the centennial year, the station re-aired archival moments, heard from generations of former staffers, and honored its founders and DXers who kept the signal alive. The tagline for the celebration? The station that started it all. Today, KDKA continues to innovate. Live studio cameras stream shows online. Podcasts let listeners catch up anytime. And on social media, the station connects with a new generation of Pittsburgh radio fans. For more than a century, the station has defied every headline that said AM is dying. Instead, it proves every day that AM is very much alive and adapting. From 1020 AM to 100.1 FM, from the radio dial to the cloud, KDKA continues to do what it's done since 1920. Serve its community, tell its stories, and send its voice across the sky.
KDKA AM and HD, KDKA FM HD2 Pittsburgh.
A radio.com station.
From the Jason Luhana Law Firm Studio, doing good by doing right.
This is KDKA Radio.
32, partly cloudy at 6 o'clock. I'm Paul Rasmussen.
KDKA AM and HD, KDKA FM HD2 Pittsburgh.
A radio.com station. From the Jason Luhana Law Firm Studio, doing good by doing right.
News on 100.1 FM and AM 1020 KDKA.
It's 11 degrees at 7 o'clock. I'm Melinda Roeder. As Americans continue to get vaccinated, albeit slower than officials would like, the number of COVID-19 cases is on the decline.
When the sun goes down and the ionosphere rises, the nighttime AM band comes alive. Static, distant voices, sounds that only DXers truly understand. And somewhere in that sea of signals, there's one that stands a little taller than most. A clear, steady, 50,000 watt voice that's been speaking since 1920. As a Class A non-directional clear channel station, KDKA signal is built to travel. By day, its ground wave covers much of Pennsylvania and also touches parts of Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, and even southern Ontario. After sunset, the skywave lifts, and that same signal can be heard hundreds, even thousands of miles away. And DXers have been chasing it for decades, such as one DXer in Charleston, South Carolina, who recently logged clean legal IDs at the top of the hour, or the DXer in Minnesota, whose 1991 QSL letter from KDKA's engineering staff confirmed reception loud and clear, 50,000 watts, non-directional. Or the young DXer in North Carolina, who one late evening in 1993 tuned in the sounds of KDKA, and after sending a reception report, the station returned the favor by sending an entire packet of station goodies, promotional materials, and more. And for a young DXer just starting out in his DX journey, this was among his very first QSLs, but that's a story for another episode. Every so often, on a good night when the band is just right, DXers in far-off places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, Newfoundland, England, Denmark, Sweden, they catch a familiar announcer's voice. This is News Radio 1020, KDKA. But the legend of KDKA's long-distance reach actually goes back even further. In 1923, Westinghouse experimented with shortwave relays of KDKA programs. Through a sister transmitter called 8XS, reports of reception came from England, and the BBC even rebroadcast greetings from America, making KDKA one of the very first stations to be heard across the Atlantic. For early DXers, it was proof that radio was limitless, a human voice carried on invisible waves across oceans and time zones. Today, that same 1020 kilohertz signal still commands respect, and DXers, we know the drill. Wait for the top of the hour ID. Listen for the words 100.1 FM and AM 1020 KDKA. A clean log, even in 2025, still feels like catching history. And thanks to modern technology, you can hear the station stream anywhere in the world. But there's something different about catching it through the air. That moment when the static parts and the signal locks in, it's sort of like shaking hands with radio's past. So whether you're spinning a dial on a 1930s Philco, tuning a modern SDR, or listening on a handheld portable in the dark, remember, when you hear that voice from Pittsburgh, you're hearing more than a station. You're hearing the first spark of broadcasting itself, still echoing across the night sky more than a century after it began. Every great origin story invites a question, and in radio's case, that question has lingered for a little bit more than a century. Was KDKA truly the first broadcast station? Well, for many years, the answer seemed simple. November 2nd, 1920, the moment celebrated as radio's official beginning. But if we dig a little deeper, you'll find that others were already on the air. In Detroit, for instance, a station called 8MK and later WWJ, well, they were broadcasting as early as August 20th, 1920, more than 2 months before KDKA's famous election night. And they were operated by the Detroit News, and 8MK aired news, music, and even election returns from Michigan state primaries. Today, the National Association of Broadcasters recognizes WWJ as the first commercial radio station in the United States. So why then does KDKA so often carry the title? Well, it's because KDKA's broadcast was the first to capture the nation's imagination. Westinghouse built KDKA specifically to reach the public, and they used that historic election night to sell radios to a new audience. It turned wireless experimenting into broadcasting as a business. And that's the difference between a first transmission and a first moment. Of course, KDKA and WWJ were not alone. In San Jose, California, Charles Doc Harold had been sending music and lectures since 1909. In New York, Lee DeForest transmitted opera in 1910. And in Montreal, XWA, later CFCF, was already testing regular broadcast by 1920. Radio's birth wasn't a single event. It was a convergence of many dreamers reaching for the same goal, to send a voice across the void. So, who was first? Maybe Detroit? Maybe Pittsburgh? Maybe even a tinkerer that you've never heard of. But KDKA was the one that made the world stop and listen. They were the one that showed that radio could unite a nation in a single night. And that, perhaps, is the only kind of first that history is going to remember. A 100 years of voices. 100 years of stories in the air. And all of it began with a few engineers, handmade transmitter, and a tent on a rooftop in Pittsburgh. KDKA was never just a station. It was a proof of concept that the invisible could connect us. Think about what that meant in 1920. A world still ruled by wires and print. Suddenly hearing a voice float out of the air, no wires, no distance, no barriers, just connection. Radio became the heartbeat of the 20th century, and KDKA was the first beat. From that first election night broadcast to war reports, sports, flood updates, and morning show laughter, KDKA has done what radio does best: bring a city and sometimes a nation together. Through depression and war, through birth of television and the rise of the internet, through every prediction of its own demise, KDKA has stood the quiet constant on the dial. And in doing so, it has become something bigger than just radio, a living thread in the fabric of American life. Every time a DXer spins the dial and catches that signal from Pittsburgh, the legacy comes alive again. A new voice meets an old one. The spark jumps across a century. That's what makes radio magical. It's not just about the transmission, it's a connection. It's not just technology, it's trust. A conversation that has never ended. Today, KDKA broadcasts on 1020 AM, 100.1 FM, and online to the world. But its mission is the same as it was in 1920, to serve the community, to inform, to inspire, and to be there when it matters. From a rooftop tent to a global stream, KDKA has proven that the power of a voice can travel further than any signal. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not just that it was one of the first, but that it never stopped being relevant. It never stopped adapting. It never stopped caring about the people on the other end of the dial. 100 years of broadcasting, a century of trust, and a signal still travels far beyond the horizon. This is the legacy of KDKA, and this is the legacy of radio itself. Hopefully you've enjoyed this first edition in our History of Radio series, a look back at the birth of modern broadcasting through the story of 1020 KDKA in Pittsburgh. The information in this episode was drawn from a variety of trusted sources, including the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, the Miller Center at the University of Virginia, Westinghouse Archives, and historical press accounts from the 1920s through the 1950s. We also included authentic archival audio from public domain newsreels and recordings preserved by archive.org and several recreated scenes to help bring the era to life. For more information and complete source links, see the podcast description. This program is intended solely for educational and historical purposes. All audio used falls under the public domain or documentary fair use guidelines. If you'd like to help support future episodes just like this one and be part of keeping radio history alive, consider joining our community on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/DXCentral for more details. Your support helps us continue producing stories that honor the voices, stations, and signals that shaped the world. The From the Static podcast is a DX Central production. I'm Lloyd Van Horn. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the next chapter in the history of radio. Until then, 73 and best of DX.
This has been the DX Central from the Static Podcast. If you are interested in sponsoring this podcast, let us know by emailing sponsors@fromthestatic.net. If you have a story to share for our Stories from the Static series, send those to our email address, stories@fromthestatic.net. Be sure to join us for our live DX live stream every Friday night at 2345 UTC, 1845 Central Time on our YouTube channel or at dxcentrallive.com.
The DX Central From the Static podcast is copyright 2025, Lloyd Van Horn, DX Central. All rights reserved. No portion of this podcast may be rebroadcast or reused without the express written authorization of Lloyd Van Horn and DX Central. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, as new episodes will be posted regularly. Join us next time for the DX Central From the Static podcast.